Dr. Lynn Gehl. Miigwech Lynn. She is an Algonquin Anishinaabe and a member of the Pikwakanen First Nation in the Ottawa Valley. She's an author, an advocate for Indigenous women and girls, and she's also an artist. I think you do wampum belts, right? You weave them. Lynn was born with a vision disability that made reading difficult, but that didn't hold her back. No, in her 30s, she got her doctorate in Indigenous Studies, and she's fought long and hard, I'll emphasize long and hard, against sex discrimination in the Indian Act, specifically against a gap in the law regarding unknown and unstated paternity. She is someone who doesn't give up. She took on the largest law firm in Canada and the Department of Justice, gaining a limited victory in 2017 through the Ontario Court of Appeal. So for 30 years, she has been a tireless advocate for Indigenous rights. Dr. Shimmy Kang, hello, joined
Peterborough Megwandid, Gizigate, Mando, Indigenous cause, and Dashagana, she knows when Lynn Gehl, up to go and do Chanandam, and Ishnabi Kwe, Wayon. Thank you, Susan, and thank you, Beatrice, and thank you for your team effort as well. So I do have a prepared remarks, and I did time them so they don't go over 3 minutes, and I would really like the opportunity to read them. So I am an Algonquin, and this is my territory, and that's what I want to talk about today. So we are on Algonquin territory. Parliament Hill, Rideau Hall, and the Supreme Court of Canada all illegally squat on my territory. The Algonquin were here in the Ottawa River Valley long before Cabot, Cartier, and Champlain arrived in this part of the world. Champlain recorded us as he traveled into the interior as the Whiskerini, the Matawiskerini, and the Kississippirini. He feasted with our one-eyed chief Tessawat, and Champlain understood it was our land and our waterscape. It was through the doctrine of discovery that the French claimed Algonquin territory, as it relegated us as savages and barbarians, not worthy of the land and the wellness it provided, our homes, our food, and our medicines. French citizens came and settled their land. The fur traders exploited our food sources, and the lumber industry destroyed our forests and dammed our rivers, whereby the Algonquin were pushed to the margins of starvation and death. It was genocide. When the British won their war against the French, according to their paradigm, they became the owners of Algonquin territory. This lie extends to this day. The British respected French landholdings, but when they expanded the boundary of Quebec around the lakes, the 13 colonies were successful in the Revolution, leaving the British with only Upper and Lower Canada. And we're at the heart. Algonquin territory is now bisected by the mighty river that once united us and all that we did. It was genocide. After the Revolution, a load of settlers and Indigenous people loyal to the British flooded into Ontario, where the lie of French-British dichotomy crystallized. And while the Algonquin were becoming an even more impoverished nation, then Canada began granting our lands free to more and more settlers, while at the same time, the Algonquin were denied our very own land. We petitioned Sir William Johnson and his son, Sir John Johnson, and numerous governor generals over and over again, but we were denied. It was genocide. The 1869 Gradual Enfranchisement Act destroyed our government structures. The sex discrimination in the Indian Act began in 1876. Our culture was criminalized in 1880. In 1927, it became illegal for us to hire lawyers for assistance. And it's not over. Canada's Algonquin genocide continues today through the modern treaty process, yet Canada and Ontario are only offering the Algonquin 1.7% of our territory and no resource revenue sharing. A nation is not a nation without land and resources. Clearly, reconciliation is more forked tongue rhetoric. Canada's Algonquin genocide continues because its parliament is on my land. Miigwech.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your passion.
Sure. So first of all, I'd like to say that I'm a member of Pikwakanen First Nation. That's Pikwakanen First Nation. That's the only Algonquin reserve here in Ontario. It's been between Algonquin Park and Parliament Hill. A lot of people struggle with pronouncing that, Pikwakanagan. It's really important that we learn the proper pronunciations of these nations whose land we are on. And by learning the proper pronunciation, we establish a better relationship with the people, because now we know their name. Now we know what they're called. So yes, I did do a lot of work on right now I'm moving into the direction of looking at Indigenous women and girls with disabilities. Whenever people talk about Black women, Asian women, white women, queer women, I don't even know if that's a proper term.
Oh, I love the word queer.
Correct. We really need to tack on women with disabilities. We really need to tack that on. Nobody wants to talk about the issue of disability, right? It's like they're afraid of it, yet we all get old and develop disabilities. So what I learned in my process of when the MMIW report came out, I was really disappointed that there was no discussion about Indigenous women and girls with disabilities, that they have a higher rate of sexual violence, of domestic violence, and online violence. I don't know how they know, but they are targeted. Of course, that's because we can't see the perpetrator coming. Sometimes we can't say who they are. We can't hear them coming. So we are targets of violence. So I was really disappointed when the MMIW didn't address that. So I at the time, it was Miriam Munsef who was the minister, and I bothered her for some funding, and I wrote up the Gale report, which addresses the fact that Indigenous women and girls, Indigenous people have a higher rate of disability. And a lot of people wonder, why is that? Is it because our bodies are inferior? Why do we have a higher rate of disability? We have a higher rate of disability because we have poor housing, poor nutrition, and no land, and poor water. So what Canada has done in building its country and mapping provincial provinces on the landscape, they also mapped on the Indigenous body disease and disability. And that number is going up and up and up. So in my report, the argument I made was that it was a really important shift when we moved from the medical model to the social model. The medical model of disability looks at, let's fix the person, what's wrong with the person. The social model was a really important shift in that it said, let's look at the structures of society. And that's a great shift. I was so happy about that shift. But as I was learning and thinking, and I drew on my creativity and my artistic skills, and I said, hey, I can birth something here. We need the political model of disability. People need to understand that the reason Indigenous people have higher rates of disability is because Canada will not share the land and resources with us. They will not give us clean land. They will not give us clean housing. They will not give us clean water. They will not give us proper nutrition. So that is genocide, right? That is a genocide. So thank you. Thank you for that question.
Susan, could I add to a little bit of
Absolutely,
that?
go for it.
Which as you're talking, I was thinking about Her Excellency this morning and talking about online violence, and she also talked about the importance of allies. So thank you for those ally comments. Appreciate it.
Pass the mic, please.
So I didn't grow up with explicit teachings taught to me. I learned it through practice. And after I learned how to, because of colonization and genocide, right? And after I learned how to read and write, and I ended up getting a PhD in Indigenous Studies. There's not too many Indigenous people with a PhD in Indigenous Studies. And I'm very proud of that. So I started out in learning. I needed to understand the human condition. I really needed to understand why we were so poor. Why were we the scum of the earth? Why did I live in the crap hole that I lived in? Why couldn't my mother feed her 8 kids? was it because we were inferior? So I started in psychology, and psychology is a very powerful discipline, but I realized it was rooted in Western knowledge philosophy, and it had a lot of limitations, and so I ended up shifting and moving into anthropology. And when I was studying anthropology, it kind of blew my mind, because I realized there's multiple ways of being a human being, multiple cultures, and every culture is a legitimate culture. And then I started to think, well, I need to move more explicitly into the Indigenous knowledge paradigm. And so I studied Indigenous studies, and my brain just started to explode. My mind was exploding, and I wasn't getting it at first, so I was just like a squirrel collecting nuts. Okay, I'm just going to collect some knowledge, and maybe it'll make sense eventually. But then I had a paradigm shift. And Indigenous knowledge is a different paradigm. It's different from the Western paradigm. I always like to compare it to Western science, which I know Western science is not a paradigm, but I will compare. It's comparative, so having a comparison usually works. So Western. It's completely different than Western science, is what I'm going to say. I started out studying chemistry as well as a young person. And I learned that beliefs are really important, and that everybody's creation story is true. And that's a belief, and I was like, well, that's really quite interesting. How can everybody's creation story be true? And then I was shifting cognitively, and then I started to think about the naturalistic paradigm versus the humanistic paradigm. And I went, well, what's the difference, naturalistic versus humanistic? And I realized that Indigenous knowledge philosophy sits closer to the naturalistic paradigm. And that's the profound shift in Indigenous knowledge. And so we value the water, the rock, winds, and fire. There are 4 sacred elements: water, rock, wind, and fire. Scientists have the periodic chart of elements. We have the 4 sacred elements. And they are sacred. And I often like to say to people, if every child grew up singing the water song in their classroom for 12 years versus O Canada, when they became a teenager, they'd be rallying for water. A real thing that they need, clean water, versus a nation state that essentially collapses their culture to a thin veneer that doesn't sustain them. And because it doesn't sustain them, because it's so collapsed, because it's such a thin veneer, they don't really know how to be a human within the naturalistic paradigm. They think that they can rule it versus respect it. So that's the most profound thing I heard. I used to hear a lot of elders say these great teachings, and I used to go, but, what about atoms and molecules? But, right? And I realized that beliefs are really important, creation stories are really important, and what you believe in will shape the world that you live in. It'll shape your policies. It'll shape your laws. So, for example, in the Anishinaabe tradition, women are sacred beings. And so that's, thank you for asking that question. So, in my work challenging sex discrimination in the Indian Act, I was stuck because I'm not a lawyer, right? And I thought, what can I contribute to these brilliant minds? And I thought, well, I can create this phrase, 6-1A all the way, and give the ideology some currency that they have to eliminate sex discrimination in the Indian Act. So I thought, well, that was a contribution, 6-1A all the way, it's my concept. And so I think that way, like what can we do? What concepts can we create? What can we do? I'm thinking sometimes that we need a superhero and a woman with a disability. We really need a superhero to give the ideology currency so that whenever anyone says, Black, Chinese, Asian, that disability's in there as well. I toss that around a lot. But I think about follow the turtle. That might be a good phrase to help people understand the importance of not leaving anyone behind. If we allow the slowest person, physically, I don't mean intellectually, or the most oppressed person, might be a better way to say it, we allow them to lead the way forward, then we will all gain what we need, right? And I say to some people that they have to stand behind the slowest person. And some people say, oh, no, we're going to stand beside. And I say, no, you're not. You're going to stand behind and push forward, push the person forward. And when they're equal, then you can stand beside them. So you literally are standing behind them. And what Her Excellency said this morning about allyship was so great. It was so great. When I was moving through Bill S3, on the issue of 618 all the way and unknown and unstated paternity, we had two white senators were our allies, and they were really important in helping us move that bill forward. That was Senator Kim Pate and Senator Mary Lou McFedrin. And there was a moment where they had to kind of educate, if you can believe it, the Truth and Reconciliation Commissioner, Murray Sinclair. They really had to, okay, let's go on camera and explain to him what the Indigenous women wanted, because he didn't quite understand what we wanted. So I was really grateful to see Senator Mary Lou McFedrin here today and Kim Pate this morning. So follow the turtle and allyship.
Couldn't you live?
And in 1985, they took that clause out. They intentionally created a gap. And through that gap, they started discriminating against children of unknown and unstated paternity. It was intentional. It was very much intentional. I picked up the case because I was denied due to an unknown and unstated paternity. I know who my father is. He doesn't know who his father is. So I picked up the case. And Canada spent $1 million challenging me. And Canada also failed to disclose evidence. So when we went to the Ontario Court of Appeal, we didn't have all the evidence. And the judge reasoned in such a poor way. She said, my application as a girl was treated the same as a boy's application. There was no analysis beneath it. She didn't care that it was an issue that women were dealing with, unknown and unstated paternity. So there was errors of law, 3 errors of law, so we were able to go to the Court of Appeal. And right at the, how do they say it, at the 11th hour, they finally produced the evidence that we were trying to get out of them because we knew it existed. And at the Court of Appeal level, the 3 judges, 3 men, at the Ontario Superior Court, it was a woman judge, by the way, who said there was no sex discrimination. At the Court of Appeal level, 3 male judges said, oh, well, there's some circumstantial evidence. He's probably an Indian. Let's make her an Indian. But what they did is they said, they didn't just say he's probably an Indian. They also said she's a 6'2" Indian, which wasn't their job to do, which is a lower form of Indian status registration. So they continued with the discrimination. And so then I had to continue to rally behind Sharon McIvor, who's a powerhouse woman. She went all the way to the United Nations because they wouldn't address the sex discrimination in her case either. And so I just rallied behind her, along with the senators that I mentioned. And it was kind of cool because, for me, it was kind of cool because the senators were pumping 618 all the way, and the United Nations also used that clause of 618 all the way, which essentially meant that everybody born before 1985, whether they're descendants of men or descendants of women, should be the same. And so that's what Sharon McIvor was able to achieve. But after she went to the United Nations and after Canada decided they had to, I don't get this, they had to, what's it called, consult. Well, human rights aren't something you consult on, right? But they just kept stalling. Eventually, the 618 all the way clauses were proclaimed in 2019, and then I was upgraded to a 618, the best kind of Indian I could be. And I don't know if people know this, but the Indian Act's going to be amended again. I think it's through Bill C-38. So what happens with Canada is they only amend legislation if there's a court case. And then what they do is they go like this, and they narrow the remedy. So instead of opening their arms and taking care of these children, they grossly narrow the remedies so that we have to go at it and go at it and go at it. So that's what I learned in my journey, and I'm telling you that if somebody told me that, I wouldn't believe it. That story, that they hid their evidence, they didn't disclose their evidence, and that they just don't want to deal with it. So Canada's goal is to continue to eliminate Indians. My only issue was, if you want to get out of the Indian Act and you want to eliminate Indians, don't you dare target mothers and babies. Don't you dare target mothers and babies. And if you want to get out of the Indian Act, get out of the Indian Act, but give us our land and resources so that we can take care of them. And they won't. They will not give us our land and resources. So they're getting rid of Indians, and they won't give us our land and resources. So they're committing genocide in both ways. And I'm not making that up. If you want to read the MMIW report, their legal analysis of genocide, where they rely on both national and international scholars, Canada's genocide is written into their laws and their policies, such as refusing to give the Algonquins their land, and Parliament sits on my land. So the genocide continues.
I see.